Questions with how are the kids? How are you today? How are your pets? How are you feeling? How are your friends? How are your friends? How are things going? How are your studies? How are your hobbies? How are your talents? How are your hobbies? How are your savings? How are your parents? How are your travels? How are your emotions? How are your memories? How are your weekends? How are your finances? How are your finances? How are your projects? How are your weekdays? How are your siblings? How are your neighbors? How are your ambitions? How are your vacations? How are your successes? How are your successes? How are your interests? How are you these days? How are your old habits? How are your new habits? How are your challenges? How are your colleagues? How are your investments? How are your experiences? How are your aspirations? How are you feeling today? How are your celebrations? How are your health goals? How are your health goals? How are your relationships? How are you managing stress? How are you embracing change? How are things going for you? How are your goals progressing? How are you building resilience? How are your spirits holding up? How are your spirits holding up? How are your interests evolving? How are you adapting to changes? How are your favorite activities? How are your family members doing? How are you coping with everything? How are you managing your workload? How are you handling uncertainties? How are your relationships evolving? How are your energy levels right now? How are your colleagues treating you? How are you nurturing your creativity? How are your hobbies bringing you joy? How are your weekend plans shaping up? How are you tackling daily challenges? How are you finding motivation lately? How are you managing time effectively? How are you exploring new perspectives? How are your sleep patterns these days? How are your daily routines serving you? How are your daily routines serving you? How are you staying true to your values? How are you exploring new opportunities? How are you creating a sense of purpose? How are you supporting those around you? How are you dealing with the challenges? How are you cultivating a growth mindset? How are you cultivating a growth mindset? How are your financial goals progressing? How are you keeping yourself entertained? How are you adjusting to the new routine? How are your health and wellness efforts? How are you adapting to new technologies? How are you celebrating your achievements? How are you staying connected with nature? How are your weekend adventures unfolding? How are you staying focused on your goals? How are you adapting to new opportunities? How are you contributing to your community? How are you maintaining a positive mindset? How are you staying connected with friends? How are you staying connected with friends? How are your communication skills evolving? How are you maintaining a positive outlook? How are you finding purpose in your actions? How are you maintaining a healthy lifestyle? How are you building meaningful connections? How are you balancing work and personal life? How are your communication skills developing?